Thanks very much, Brigadier. Thanks, Professor Clark. Morning, everyone. It's a real honour for me to be here and to speak to you and to have had a tour of this incredible place, which has done so much, not only in the history of leadership, but also in the history of this country. So it's a real privilege for me. Now, in the hierarchy of life experience, I'm in a very unfortunate position today because the speaker is unfortunately trumped by the listeners. Because as the Brigadier just said, professional sports, of course, it's a serious challenge. Your body is tested, your bravery is tested to a degree, your decision-making is tested under pressure, you're in public. As we just heard, the scope for error without criticism is pretty small. So in this sort of conventional setting, as a speaker, if I was in a corporate setting, I'd be able to talk about how incredibly difficult it is when a ball's going past your nose at 90 miles an hour, to make good decisions, how incredibly hard it is to balance, to lead players in a team when you're captain, all those kinds of things, nurturing followership while also showing strength in a leadership context. But there is, of course, a fairly large problem, as you will have guessed, which is that whatever a sportsman might go through, it is in fact the opposite of life and death. Sport is a metaphor or an abstraction that then transmuted into an entertainment. So it's very much a figurative form of experience rather than the real thing. And when people say that a tennis match has been gladiatorial, I know what they mean, but I think I'd still be much happier as the tennis player. So in short, I guess the problem I have today is that the toy shop of the world, professional sport, should be very cautious and modest when it starts lecturing to the structural engineers, the defense of the realm. So in the hierarchy of life experience, I'm very conscious of my limitations. Nonetheless, I did come to believe very much as a player, and now I believe very much as a writer, in the power and value of analogy, and also the fact that many of the ideas that make the most impact on us actually come from adjacent or parallel spheres. I learnt more about decision-making in sport from reading Nassim Taleb, who's a trader turned public philosopher, whose real interest is about risk and probability, than I did from reading the sports pages of the papers or reading books by managers saying, this is why I was so brilliant when I won with a very good team that probably would have won anyway. And since retiring, and since, if you like, being more interested in sport as a vehicle for ideas, which is what I want to talk about today, I'm not so much interested in sport for sport. You know, some teams win, some teams lose. If there's not ideas at play, it doesn't really capture me. When sport is a vehicle for ideas, that's when I come alive. And the person who's probably taught me more about that is Howard Marks, who's a kind of Warren Buffett-style investor, massively successful American investor, who really looks at investment as a way of understanding probability and philosophical questions about how you make judgments and decisions. They're the things that excite me. So if I've learnt most from things outside sport, perhaps sport can have some relevance to spheres which are more important and more significant than the question of whether 11 cricketers beats a different 11. So my theme today, it's provocative in a way. I want to talk about confidence, and I want to talk about the limitations of confidence, the risks that come with confidence. And the reason it's provocative is that most of us always hear about confidence as being a good thing. And I think we revere confidence in leaders. But what I'm going to explore and try and tease out is of the many different types of leadership, many contexts in which leadership operates, the question of having confidence is actually not very relevant. In actual fact, it may become more of a problem than an asset. I mean, I've spent my life around confident people, and as a test match special commentator, I'm surrounded by people who know everything about everything that's going on in the world all the time, and they're normally sitting next to me. Not all of them from Yorkshire, but some of them are. Confident sportsmen, confident coaches, confident broadcasters, confident pundits, very confident newspaper leader writers. And on one level, you know, I've probably been perceived as being confident too. You need a measure of confidence to take the field as a professional sportsman. You need a measure of confidence to write opinion pieces every week. After all, you know, you believe it, and that's why you're writing it. But the question that's been stealing up on me for probably 10 years is, this confidence stuff, is it actually correlated with being right, for example? Something like that. And I think that the big problem with confidence is it has value as an act, but shouldn't be mistaken for a methodology. And I actually begin to fear that, in my experiences in sport, tell me that being highly confident all the time is actually quite highly correlated with being wrong. So what I want to explore today is how can we stay close to the fact that even very good minds are often mistaken, often misled, often inadequate. And how can we ask the question, how we go about exploring the question, how can we be less wrong in the future than we have been in the past? The very first and most trivial answer is by having a better memory. There's a great quote from Milan Kundera's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which says, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." Well, I've tweaked it for my speech today. The struggle of leaders against powerlessness is the struggle of memory against forgetting. If you don't remember when you've been wrong, you're probably not going to make a very good job of being more often right in the future. Now, let's talk about confidence in a more traditional setting for a moment. Of course, you're going to need confidence to perform. If you were a manager of a football team and your penalty taker came up to you and said, "I don't feel very confident about scoring this penalty," you say, "Just before you take it, do you mind if I get someone else to do it?" He's going to need to have confidence to do that very simple but crucial role. And I know from my experience as a batsman that it's sometimes better to play the wrong shot with total conviction than it is to play the right shot lamely and expecting to fail. So in some contexts, there's no doubt that confidence is absolutely central and bound up with success. And I would say one of the things the sportsman does, the great sportsman does, is he turns uncertainty, and it's a bit of a risk, and he somehow flips it and transmutes it into conviction and faith. So when you're actually acting out something, obviously your belief, your confidence, your conviction that you're going to succeed has a bearing on the likelihood of whether it does succeed. So that's a given, and I would never disagree with that. Of course you need confidence to hit a six, to take a penalty, to do any of the things where you are the agent and you are the principal actor in the drama. But a lot of decision making doesn't exist in that domain. And let me tell you a story where I started to understand that quite graphically. Was before a crucial Ashes Test match. This was after I'd retired. It was the pivotal day of the whole series, it turned out. And I happened to be on the pitch just before the day's play with one of the selectors of the two teams. And he told me how incredibly confident he was feeling. He was feeling very, very confident. And the boys were really up for it. They were feeling very confident. The team he'd picked, he was very, very happy with that. They couldn't wait to get out there. And the whole message he sent me was radiating confidence. And I sort of nodded and I was slightly quizzical. And I walked away. I thought to myself, there's something not quite right about this conversation, which is the fact he's not playing. It doesn't make any difference anymore. His decisions have been made. And I was quite struck by the absence of skepticism, the absence of doubt. Or I didn't discern in that conversation that he had grappled a great deal with all the ways in which he could have been wrong in his decision making. It just seemed to be taken as a fait accompli that he was right and that was going to be a helpful position to take half an hour before play when he was not in fact going to be an agent on the field. Now what happened is, it underlined my quizzical reaction to it was that the team lost and the Ashes went in the other direction that particular day. But it made me realise that as a selector, as a pure decision maker, he could not be living in a more opposite realm than his opening batsman. They were in the same activity, sport, had the same goal, which was to win, but their tools were actually completely different. One was simply involved with cold decision making. After he'd made the decision, it made no difference whatsoever whether he believed in it or not. He was like an investor pressing a button saying buy or sell, or like a gambler placing his chips, and once it's done, it's done. You can't actually inject confidence into that scenario any longer. As well, the player, of course, continues by his self-belief to influence the likelihood of the outcome going in the way he wanted to. So there's a distinction to make between a decision maker who's not a performer and a performer who is actually out there doing the stuff. Now this leads me, it's incredible to think that I got through 10 years without really grappling with that as a player. And here's my conjecture, I think, my hypothesis I want to explore today, is that we're so used to admiring the first type of confidence, the penalty taker without doubt, the person who can bowl a Yorker at the death of a cricket match and always nail his spot. We're so used to admiring that inside the wider community of sport that we actually completely forget the fact that many or most circumstances in which decision-making matters operate in an entirely different context. So if you think about all the aspects of leadership in sport which cannot be classified in the realm of performance, which people to hire, which people to select, when to change tactics, how not to become too attached to your own ideas, how to remember your mistakes, how to spot that better ideas exist elsewhere, when to ignore a stereotype. None of those things has got anything to do with the stereotype of the confident performer. Okay, so here's an example, enough theory. Let me just make a confession. So one of the things I do is I'm involved on the strategy side or the coaching side of one of the teams in the IPL, Royal Challengers Bangalore. And when I joined in 2016, the top three batsmen were Chris Gale, AB de Villiers and Virat Kohli. So I said to the head coach, I'll come as long as you don't expect me to teach anything about batting to those guys who are so much better than I am. So that was the first thing I wanted to make clear. Now, interesting story about what behavioural science would call classification bias. So one of the people I met that first week at Royal Challengers Bangalore in the IPL. You don't have to know anything about cricket, by the way, I promise you. All you have to know is that Test cricket is not so much about power, and 2020 is more about power. If you have no interest in cricket, it's absolutely fine. I met this guy called KL Rahul, who was in our squad, but wasn't in the team. Anyway, so we got chatting with him. Very polite guy, very well-spoken, intelligent. And as a player, he was a classical style player, had a beautiful stance, almost old-fashioned textbook style player. Got chatting to him, he's from Bangalore. Someone who I used to play with called Rahul Dravid was the most old-fashioned classical test batsman of the lot, also from Bangalore. So I'm joining up all these dots. I'm thinking very polite, articulate guy, old-fashioned stance, knows Rahul Dravid, test batsman. Not really 2020 batsman, looks more like a test batsman. And that's kind of what I've got in my head. And then someone comes past me and I say, we're watching KL Rahul, and he says, he's probably a bit more of a test player than a T20 player. Thought no more of it. Then we shuffled the pack mid-season. I was back in England by that point, and he ended up opening the batting. And all I'm seeing is this ball flying out the ground everywhere, and KL Rahul's hitting sixes left, right and centre. He's outscoring everyone in the team. I'm thinking to myself, well, we didn't see that one coming. And then I actually remembered the practice session the first time I met him. I was thinking back to it, and I was just trying to say, what did I actually see? And what he did was he hit massive sixes. But I wasn't really watching because I was so busy telling myself a story about what type of person he was and what type of player he was. So basically, I'd leapt confidently to make a classification of a player based on surface issues, and I'd actually missed the substantive ones. Now, that's basically what happens all the time in sport. He, by the way, now has an international strike rate higher than anyone, 150 runs per 100 balls, higher even than AB de Villiers, Chris Gale, Virat Kohli. So he's carried on pretty much where he left off, a couple of injuries notwithstanding. The point is that he was both. He was a test player and a power player. But we don't really have that classification as easily to hand, starting to develop now with players like Virat Kohli. So in the absence of a more sophisticated set of categories, I'd put him in the wrong one. Now, Daniel Kahneman, who pretty much founded the discipline of behavioral economics, as I said earlier, would have called this classification bias. And there's an amazing story from the NBA. So one of the teams had a very good model. One of the things we're all involved with in leadership is talent ID. Can you identify who's going to be good? Who's going to make the difference to your organization and your team? Very, very difficult, and you never get them all right. One team, Houston Rockets, had a very, very good model that helped them with talent ID before each year's auction, draft, whatever they call it in the NBA. And they said, you really want us, the model and the analytics department said, you really want to sign this guy, Jeremy Lin. But all the coaches, when they were presented with that information, said, no, we don't want to do that, something we don't like. And when they actually asked themselves why, they said, we don't think he's very athletic. We don't think he's a great athlete. Turned out that he went somewhere else, was a brilliant athlete. But he wore glasses, he was Asian, he was very tall, and they thought, not a great athlete. If he'd looked differently, they later admitted, with great honesty, Daryl Morey, the general manager of Houston Rockets, they probably would have signed him. So they made an assessment based on an overconfident ability to jump to substantive judgments based on the wrong information. And I think that's something that happens all the time inside professional sport. Chris Rogers was a kind of nuggety, not very pretty player who had to wait till he was in his late 30s to play regularly for Australia. Ended up being one of their best players for that period of time. Now, why did he not play? Because he didn't look like what people think a test player should look like. James Vince has played 12 tests without that much scrutiny for England, without massive success. How's he managed to play 12 tests by the age of 26, where Chris Rogers had to wait till he was 36 for his opportunities? The reason is because he looks like a test player, just doesn't get many runs. So these are all versions, really, of what Kahneman called the classification bias and the representative bias. So that then leads me to ask, what are people really worried about inside professional sport? What is it that holds people back from doing a better job of challenging these kinds of assumptions and prejudices, if we're honest? There's a nice saying in business that the ultimate goal for people in business is not actually to make money, which is where everyone assumes it is, but it's to avoid getting shouted at by the boss. And having just seen some drill outside at the academy here, I can understand it's even more important not to make conspicuous errors in this environment. But I sometimes wonder in sport whether the ultimate fear is actually not losing. We all say we hate losing, but I think the ultimate fear actually is losing in a way that draws attention to your decision making looking unconventional or risky or flawed. But here's the problem. If you herd towards conventional decisions, how do you actually achieve a competitive advantage? And here's where I think investors are actually involved in a very interesting methodology, because their world is completely cold. There's no room for emotion in whether your trade succeeds or not. And Howard Marks has this brilliant line: in the course of trying to be different and better, you have to bear the risk of being different and worse. So the real money, Marx goes on, isn't made in buying what other people like. It's about buying what others underestimate. And that can be a lonely business. And I think the loneliness of being a contrarian thinker or an original thinker is underestimated. And it's often small decisions that later get forgotten that create the foundations for winning teams. And let me give you an example from football. When Pep Guardiola came to England beginning of last season, when Manchester City did not win the Premier League title, pretty much the first decision he made was Joe Hart goes. Now that's a big risk on lots of levels. First of all, ideologically, his reason is very simple, which is he wants his teams to play out from the back, so the goalkeeper's the first distributor. So if the goalkeeper's not perceived to be a very good passer and decision maker, Guardiola wants someone else. So can you find someone better and quickly? Risk number one, not easy. Risk number two is that Hart's obviously England's number one goalkeeper. He was, at that point, first choice. So you are basically taking on a sporting culture which you're just entering. And you know for a fact that Hart's agents are going to place interviews with all the sympathetic football writers at the Times and the Mail and so on. And every time you lose a game, particularly if your new goalkeeper does badly, the spectre of poor English Joe who's been cast aside by ideological, ruthless foreigner is going to come up over and over again. And that's exactly what happened. The new goalkeeper did make mistakes. Guardiola gets criticised every week. That's the subliminal message. If he hadn't got rid of good, lion-hearted Joe Hart, Man City wouldn't be in this mess. But now, when Man City are 12 points clear or whatever it is today, based on the fact they're playing out from the back, based on the fact they have a different goalkeeper, that's a foundation, not the whole story, but it's a foundation of it. The situation looks very difficult. But we forget how lonely and isolated Guardiola was when he made those decisions. Exactly the same decision he made about Ibrahimovic at Barcelona. Potentially could have been regarded as the best player in the world at the time. Everywhere he'd gone, they won the league. Here I am, we always win. He said, here you are, you're not playing. A massive risk. You risk losing part of the dressing room, But great managers consistently will do things that expose them to the risk of looking unconventional and wrong. That's where the value is. I think the real evolution of sport, how sports got better, is when people have been prepared to take those risks. You know, Dick Fosbury, who you'll be too young to have seen, and I am too. I was born in 77, and the pivotal moment in Fosbury's career was 68, had to negotiate with his coaches about when he was allowed to do his Fosbury flop as a high jumper. So actual fact, initially he did a trade with his coach where he said, okay, well, I'll train with the old way, but can I compete with the new way, or vice versa? And it was all, everyone thought he was mad. His coaches and his friends said, you can't possibly try this new crazy technique. There's an Olympics coming up in 2 years. Eventually, he says, there's a better way of doing it, and even if I look stupid, I'm going to do it. Of course, he wins gold, breaks the world record, and since then, everyone's done it pretty much that way. You know, there was a risk when Kevin Peterson, who was a brilliant, brilliant player for all his difficulties, says, I'm going to change the way my hands sit on the bat, and I'm going to play a reverse hit. Not just a reverse sweep, I'll hit a reverse hit. And he did it for the first time on a televised international match, hit it for 6. Now, think of all the pundits who have been waiting, who didn't like Peterson anyway, to jump down his throat for taking that risk on that stage. But he says, I'm making a calculation. All the fielders are over there. I want to hit it over there. The easiest thing to do is to change my hands over and bat left-handed. Taking a risk, and that's where evolution happens. You know, in a different way, Virat Kohli has taken a huge risk as captain of India by committing himself to an incredibly demanding weight training regime, where he says, I train every day, I lift weights before playing cricket. That was not part of wider cricket culture, let alone Indian cricket culture. And of course, if he'd failed and he'd underperformed, it would have been, you know, well, he's training too hard, he's tired, blah, blah. Virat said, no, I've got touch, I've got skill, I've got all that stuff. If I can add greater power and explosiveness, then I can push back the parameters of what can be done with a cricket bat. That's what he's done. He's become probably the greatest player across all the formats of the modern era, and certainly the greatest player in white ball cricket. And a lot to do with the fact that he challenged, through a very close relationship with an Olympic sprinter, how you prepare. He took a big risk. I think back to my own playing days, and you know, a very small thing we did that ended up to be quite helpful. When I was there at the start of 2020, and conventional wisdom was you stack the side with batsmen and everyone bowls an over or two. What happened was that over or two was going for 20 or 25 runs. So when I was captain of Middlesex, we said, right, we're going to play the 5 best bowlers, and they bowl 4 overs each. So make it hard for the opposition so they don't get any freebies. Now we played the 5 bowlers every game, all tournament, won the T20 competition, and that was the first major tournament we'd won for 15 years. Now, it looks sensible when it's happened, but in actual fact, taking the field with only 5 bowlers and not 6 or 7 would have left me looking, and the captain, who captained when I was injured, very exposed if things had gone wrong. Makes me think about this herding behind conventional wisdom. Makes me think about how often conventional wisdom has been wrong and unchallenged. So even if we think about something as relatively straightforward as diet and nutrition. So when I started as a professional athlete, all the talk was about reducing fat and increasing the ratio of carbohydrates. So everyone was eating low-fat bagels, even though they actually make you fat. Now the problem is that fat had a PR problem. That fat doesn't make you fat, but it's the same word as fat. So the food type was being blurred with the physical appearance. In the same way, fat, of course, makes you full, which means you don't get fat. In the same way, cholesterol, for a long time, was linked to heart disease. So people thought that eating cholesterol, like eggs, led you to have a heart attack, because cholesterol is found inside the heart in many people who have suffered with heart problems. But the thing that's being left out there is that there's called a digestion process. So exterior properties were being confused with interior properties. It's a fairly major problem, you would think, if you were a nutritionist, not to make the distinction between actually what you're putting in your mouth and what actually ends up near your heart. But it's exactly the same in sport. Often we fail to make a distinction between the internal need for the protagonist to have confidence, to have belief, to radiate conviction, and the fact that in many circumstances that has nothing to do with whether or not it's the right decision to make and whether or not history will bear out the decision-making process as being prudent and sensible. So confidence doesn't help people to make better decisions, but it does inspire commitment, I think, once those decisions have already been made. And of course, we all know that teammates are going to scrutinize every aspect of how you look and how you seem when you're in a leadership position. I guess what I'd finish with is that I'm not denying that confidence isn't an essential part of performance. I'm not denying it's an essential part of a public persona. But I am saying there are very big risks about getting high on your own supply of confidence. I think second level thinking, I think what I'm trying to do with the Institute of Sports Humanities, which I'm setting up in London at the University of Buckingham, is actually to develop the ability to live with both those strands simultaneously. I think it's very hard. It's very hard when you're a father to both question all your decisions, or a parent of course, and also to still retain authority. Because you must question yourself, but also you recognize the fact that someone much younger than you is looking up to you and he needs to see simplicity and clarity. So you need to be on two tracks at the same time, and often you feel yourself almost being torn apart by it. And I think it's the same thing for leaders. I think they must learn to hone, to develop the ability to be confident when they're the actor, to radiate confidence when they're the protagonist, but also to expose themselves to a level of critical scrutiny and skepticism about all their decisions, which makes their life actively uncomfortable. So it looks easy, but it's actually all the time getting harder and harder. And the final point is a selfish one, which is that in autumn 2019, when I launched the Institute of Sports Humanities, I hope someone from this room, from the Army, will come and tell me how you do it, where it really matters. Just don't do it too confidently. So thank you very much for listening. It's been a real privilege to be here, and look forward to Lloyd and I are going to take questions and develop it, this conversation in any way that interests you or engages with any part of the journey that you're on. So thank you very much.